Good morning. It's really weird seeing your faces. I just had to imagine what you looked like for the last 2 weeks. You look much better in person than I remembered, so that's a good thing. It is good to be with you this morning. We have people all over the place, and we have guests here, so if you're visiting with us, welcome. We are glad that you're here this morning. We're going to be moving forward in our study of Matthew. We're in Matthew 25 this morning, which is on page 795, if you'd like to turn there. In these Bibles we share, but we have a new memory verse we're kicking off this week. We read it for the first time last week in our study of Matthew 24. This is going to be the one that we learn as we kind of go through the end of Matthew's gospel. So let's say this memory verse together. If the master returns and finds that the servant has done a good job, there will be a reward. All right, you heard it once, let's say it again. If the master returns and finds that the servant has done a good job, there will be a reward. Do me a favor and put a little emphasis on the word good and on the word reward, okay? Let's sound like this is something we're excited about. Should be a good thing. Here we go. If the master returns and finds the servant has done a good job, there will be a reward. That's a great thing. So we're going to be in Matthew 25 today, but it would help to remember where we've been, especially if you haven't been here. Because in a lot of ways, this sermon feels like the culmination of the last two. And I don't think that's just because I had to record the last two in my office on COVID quarantine. In fact, it's like the last two chapters we had back in 22 is the triumphal entry and the cleansing of the temple. And then for 2 chapters after that, 23 and 24, Jesus has been judging the religious and political system. There's been these long discourses and these arguments between him and the political and the religious leaders. And in those sermons, it's felt like it's building towards something. So in 23 and 24, for about the first half of the chapter, Jesus is in the process of judging the system as it is. And then last week what we saw is at the end of 24, he begins to shift and talk to his disciples about his expectations for them until he returns. That's where we're going to be this morning, is squarely in the middle of those expectations. Now, after this, we're going to see a big transition out of this chunk in the temple from 22 to 25. Once we get to next week, we're going to start talking about the last hours of Jesus' life. But what Jesus has been prepping in his condemnation and judgment of the temple system, he is now setting up his disciples, us, to rule in his place, to live according to his teachings once that system is gone. And we're going to see that in his teaching this morning. Will the disciples be faithful when Jesus is gone? And we're going to see Jesus explain what faithfulness looks like in 3 parables this morning. So let's jump into Matthew 25. We're going to read this in 3 different chunks this morning. So let's read the parable of the bridesmaids. 25, verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids. All right, pause for just a second. I can't even get through the first sentence. This is going to be a long sermon, huh? No. Notice a shift in tense here. You have to see this for everything we're going to talk about to make sense. For all of the gospel of Matthew, the emphasis has been on Jesus' gospel, Jesus' good news, which is the kingdom of heaven is where? It's at hand. It's near. Okay? And all of his parables thus far have been, the kingdom of heaven is like. And Jesus will talk about the kingdom, what God's rule is like. That's what kingdom means, the rule of God. And it's always been, it's now. But did you see the shift in tense? Then the kingdom of heaven will be like. Do you see the shift in tense? Now we're finally talking about the future. Now the kingdom of heaven is like this, but then the kingdom of heaven will be like. There's a shift here, and this shift is important. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The 5 who were foolish didn't take enough olive oil for their lamps, but the other 5 were wise enough to take along extra oil. When the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, They were roused by the shout, "Look, the bridegroom is coming. Come out and meet him." All the bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. Then the 5 foolish ones asked the others, "Please, give us some of your oil because our lamps are running out." But the others replied, "We don't have enough for all of us. Go to a shop and buy some for yourselves." But while they were gone to buy oil, the bridegroom came. Then those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was locked. Later, when the other 5 bridesmaids returned, they stood outside calling, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he called back, "Believe me, I don't know you. So you too must keep watch, for you do not know the day or the hour of my return." As we talk about the 10 bridesmaids, we're not going to go super deep into any of these 3 parables. Instead, during the sermon time, what I want you to see is the general flow of what Jesus is teaching us, because I think this is going to be revolutionary for some of us. It requires a mental shift. But notice a few things that are very intentional. The bridesmaids have been invited to a great party. We talked a few weeks ago about what a wedding party would be like. It's a feast that lasts for days or even potentially a week. They've been invited to this great party, but the groom didn't come back on schedule. He was delayed. And so the bridesmaids have now focused on other things. They thought this was going to be a quick thing when it took longer. Now there are consequences. Notice that they all fell asleep. All 10 of the bridesmaids got drowsy, they dozed off. Took longer than expected, they all went to sleep. And the fact that they get tired in this parable isn't the big deal. It's the fact that some of them are unprepared when the bridegroom finally does show up. You see, for some of these bridesmaids, they're in it for a short time. They're in it as long as it's convenient or easy, as long as it goes on their schedule, according to their plan. They're not prepared that things might take a little longer. And so when the bridegroom does show up, 5 of them are prepared and 5 of them are not. Now, when we read these stories, these 3 parables, at least for me, my brain goes to those who are left out. I don't know about you. Part of it's, a fear response, honestly. As a kid, being absolutely terrified of the idea of hell, and so I don't want to be one of the 5 that's left out. I don't want to be the one servant that comes next who is rejected. I don't want to be the goats when Jesus starts dividing people. It's easy for your heart to go out to those who are left behind. Isn't the king unfair? Isn't the master unjust? Except, I want to start where Jesus starts, that all of these people are invited to a great party. The primary mode at which God relates to his people is that of generosity and invitation. Do you see that? This is not the king who is looking to exclude. It is the king who is invited to include everyone. But these people, these bridesmaids, they weren't in it for the long haul. What about the 5 who weren't prepared? Isn't it unfair for them to be excluded? When I was in college, one of the required classes was college biology. Now, I love science. I love science, and I love biology. In high school, I loved that teacher, and I loved that class. And then I got to college biology, and it was the second worst course I took the entire time I was there. The professor, you remember, was it Ben Stein, Win Ben Stein's Money? You remember the commercials he did for Visine, for dry red eyes? This was that professor. Welcome to College Biology 101. Open your textbooks to page 5. I had it Tuesdays and Thursdays for an hour and a half, right before lunch. I slept so good in that class. This professor, he made you buy course notes on DVD to go in your disk drive on your computer. For your young people, there used to be a tray to put a DVD in. Actually, for your young people, a DVD was like a record, but plastic and small. Anyway, you had to buy his DVD course that was all the class notes that you would then be required to go fill out notes as you watched it on your computer. And I put in the DVD because I was falling asleep during the classes thinking, oh, finally I'm going to learn something. I missed everything he just taught. And I put in the DVD and I hit play, and there's a slide that comes up and I hear, "Welcome to Biology 101. It was his voice. He was the chair of the department, and it was the exact same class. He had just put his slides on DVD. And so do you know what I did at my computer desk in my dorm room? I tried so hard to study and prepare for that first test, and I love biology. And I got into that first test having done everything that I could to prepare, and I failed it miserably. Well, I realized that the professor taught the exact same thing in class as he did on the DVDs, and that professor also didn't take attendance. So at that point, I was done. I stopped coming to class, period. And then I slept through the next course, and I got ready to show up to take the test, except for that this test, he did something different. It was no longer in the classroom. For the rest of the test, it was in a computer lab. Now, maybe for some of our college students, this is a normal thing. This was brand new at Harding. The idea that you could show up and take your test at a computer in the lab where there was no professor. And so I showed up completely unprepared, and I walk in and I see a buddy of mine sitting at this computer. And I walk up next to him, I'm like, "Hey man, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm taking my biology test." I'm like, "Oh, I'm not in class with you." He said, "Yeah, I go on the earlier session." "Oh, mind if I sit here?" He said, "Sure. I see you have your notes there." "Oh, yeah, I'm using my notes to take the test. The professor said it was okay." "Well, fantastic. I haven't really been going to class. Could I use your notes?" He's like, "Yeah, there's some questions I'm struggling with. I have a brilliant idea. How about we use your notes for the questions that you know the answer to, and then anything you don't know the answer to, I will Google." And we knocked that test out of the park. I went from an F to an A. And I didn't go to a single class. Now, there's a word for what we were doing. What is it? Cheating. It didn't feel like cheating, and I'm actually being honest about this. It did not feel like cheating because I've never been in a place where you could just get on the internet and Google the answers to your test. I understand for all you kids. Y'all are like, seriously, I do this on my phone with math. I just take a picture. This was brand new tech. It didn't feel like cheating, but I cheated my way through the next 4 tests and got A's on all of them. He had the notes, I had Google, and we knocked it out of the park. And then for the final, the professor announced that it was going to be a comprehensive final, and it was going to be taken live and in person in the classroom. And all of a sudden, I was very concerned because I didn't know the material. And I certainly didn't know it comprehensively. And I hadn't taken a live test in a very long time in that class, so I spent the final couple of weeks of this class studying everything we had done on my own. I still never went to class. I just showed up for the final. And when I got to the final, well, I'll tell you what happened when I got to the final in just a minute, but the short version is I failed. And the A in that class, I was lucky to have gotten a C to keep my GPA up enough that I needed for my scholarship just to get through it. Even cheating, I couldn't do a good job in that class because I was not ready for the test. I went from assuming at the beginning that I was going to fail to thinking I was going to pass with stellar colors, and then at the end, finding out at the very end of the class that I had not been preparing in the right way the entire time. Now, whose fault was that? It's mine. 100%. It was my fault that I was unprepared for the test. The professor had taught the material, at least sort of, and I had the option to go and I had the option to study, and I was unprepared. In the parable of the bridesmaids, Jesus is teaching us that we cannot succeed based on someone else's preparedness. I had cheated my way through for a while, but by the time the rubber really met the road, when it mattered the most, I was entirely unprepared. The bridesmaids had been expecting that the bridegroom would come and they were going to ace the test easily. But when things went long, they're left holding an empty lamp and asking their friends, "Can I use yours?" And Jesus says, that's not the way this thing works. When I'm gone, I may be delayed. I don't know when I'm coming back, and neither do you. In discipleship, We train one another, we encourage one another, but at some point, it either becomes your lifestyle or it doesn't. You either follow Jesus or you don't. And no amount of borrowing from someone else's righteousness is ultimately going to get you where Jesus is calling you to be. You can only stand around other people who are faithful for so long before it becomes your and my responsibility. You can't cheat your way to the final. Do you follow Jesus or do you not? When Jesus returns, will he find you faithful or not? Will you be waiting on him, eagerly awaiting the party he has promised, or will other things have distracted you along the way? And if Matthew 25 is the antidote that keeps the church from drinking the poison that Jesus has been condemning in the temple system for the last 2 chapters, if that's what this is supposed to be, is the antidote for that, then the first thing we learn is this. As we wait for Jesus, we must keep the main thing. Faithful disciples keep their love for Jesus front and center. At the end of the day, you and I have been invited to a party. There's a bridegroom coming. Do you love him enough to be prepared when he finally shows up? Because it's taken a while. What did I tell you last week? If someone asks you, are you going to be alive when Jesus comes back? Statistically, the answer is no. I don't know for sure, but just based on the past 2 millennia. 75, 80, 90 years didn't seem that long at the end of it. At least that's what I'm told. But it's a long time to be faithful along the journey, isn't it? The only way you get through it is if your love for Jesus is enough to keep you eager for what he has invited you into. And so faithful disciples keep their love for Jesus front and center. They are eagerly waiting for the bridegroom to return. We are Jesus followers waiting for Jesus. Everything else is secondary. Jesus is our first love, and our allegiance is for him. That's the first parable he tells. And then he moves on to another one. These will all 3 connect, I promise. He says, again, in verse 14, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and entrusted his money to them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. Then he left on his trip. The servant who received the 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with 2 bags of silver went to work and earned 2 more, but the servant who received 1 bag dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. After a long time, their master returned from his trip and called them to give an account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I've earned 5 more. The master was full of praise. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount. So now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. The servant who had received the 2 bags of silver came forward and said, Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I've earned 2 more. And the master said, well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I'll give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. Then the servant with 1 bag of silver came and said, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look, here's your money back. But the master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it. Then he ordered, take the money from this servant and give it to the one with 10 bags of silver. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. If the parable of the bridesmaids is about keeping the first thing, keeping your first love front and center, then the parable of the talents is about working faithfully to grow the kingdom while the king is away. The disciples are like servants, and once again, in the first parable, the bridesmaids have been invited to a great party. In the second parable, the servants had been given millions of dollars. That's the value we're talking about here. 5 million, 2 million, 1 million. Do you give $1 million to someone you don't trust? You shouldn't. If you do, you'll only do it once. Some of you invested in crypto last year. You're like, well, actually, that's a very inside joke. I apologize. If you give somebody $5 million to invest, you trust that person. You assume that they have the capacity to do something good with it. This master, again, is shown to be a generous person. God is always shown by Jesus to be generous. He is inviting them to participate in all this wealth he's accumulated. He goes, 5 million for you, 2 million for you, 1 million for you. I'm going to be gone a while. Do something good with it. When I show up, have more. Man, okay, maybe the crypto joke didn't hit. So how about this? Some of you have gone on trips with the company credit card. When you get to use the company credit card, do you eat at Taco Bell? No. You go to the nice restaurants. You stay in the comfortable hotel rooms. You go to the resort on the company dime. If the company's paying for it, you're treating yourself well because the company has trusted your value enough to give you that privilege. Enjoying the wealth of the master here is being invited into something generous and abundant. And these guys, the first two, take their money and they invest it. When the master shows up, he's like, you guys are the best. And the third guy shows up and goes, I was afraid of you. And the master sees right through that. Says, you weren't afraid. He calls the servant 2 words, wicked and lazy. He said, with the amount of money I gave you, you could have done just about anything with it and made more. But at the very least, I wanted you to try. And again, this is not the master rolling the dice, hoping that they'll make a little more money. This is a wise, savvy, wealthy investor. And he's inviting people with capacity in to make him more money. This person has been using the company credit card and not working for the company while he's gone. I'm going to bury it in the ground. I'm going to do nothing with it. At the end of the day, he does not have the master's best interest in mind. He doesn't care what happens with the master's money. And so he's called lazy. Now, the way that verse 27 phrases this, for a long time, made it sound like the master was a jerk, the way that I read it. It says, the master said... the man said, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. And then the master confirms this down in verse 27. He said, you knew this about me. Why didn't you at least get me a little bit of interest? The master can sound like a jerk, but he isn't a jerk. He's a savvy businessman. He knows how to invest his money to make more. And the fact that his servant wasn't interested in following his example is what makes him wicked and lazy. Jesus invites us to do what he would do while he is away. He has shared his kingdom with his disciples. You've been invited to the best invitation that's ever been thrown out there. Now, while I'm gone, continue to grow the kingdom. Well, Jesus, how do we do that? In all the same ways that Jesus has been doing it. We've now gone through 25 chapters that have been showing us how Jesus grew his kingdom and how he equipped us disciples to do the same. He says, I'm going to be gone. I've given you this incredibly valuable thing. When I come back, I expect you to have grown it. I expect you to invest in the world around you the way that Jesus has invested his own life. And when we do that, faithful servants get a reward. So if the first thing the disciples needed to hear is to keep their love for Jesus front and center, the second thing is this: faithful disciples stay on mission. Jesus has a mission. The kingdom of heaven is here. Now go and grow the kingdom. I worry deeply for churches that are not interested in spreading the kingdom in their community, that are not interested in the lost, that are not interested in the places in the world around them that are broken. I worry deeply for those churches that are so internally focused that they've forgotten that they're not called to bury their talent in the ground. They're called to spread it, to invest it, so that the kingdom might grow when the king returns. Woe to the church that buries its talents, its bags of silver, if you will. And then there's one final parable. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered in his presence, and he will separate the people as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll place the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then these righteous ones will reply, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? Or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will say, "I tell you the truth. When you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me." Then the king will turn to those on his left and say, "Away with you, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his demons, for I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty. You didn't give me a drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked. You didn't give me clothing. I was sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will reply, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and not help you?" And he will answer, "I tell you the truth. When you refused to help one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were refusing to help me. And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life." This is the final judgment. And if you're focused on the ones who have been rejected along the way, this is the part that really starts to scare you, isn't it? This is the part that keeps you up at night. But before we do that, let's again start with the generosity that Jesus starts with. Look in verse 34. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father." We've seen that word blessed before, haven't we? I recall your mind back to the Sermon on the Mount. "You who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world." Pause for a second. Let's talk about kingdom. We've been talking about this as we've gone, but it's good to remember what we're talking about, because for a lot of us, our mind just raced to what we've been told about heaven. But the kingdom of heaven is the word basileia. Say basileia. It means the direct rule or reign of God. That's what the kingdom is, the rule of the king. And so the reign of God among us is what Jesus came to declare. Here's what it looks like when God reigns among you, and someday God will rule among you in your very presence. That's what this description is. That's what heaven is, the reign of God among us. And so Jesus says, this is the reign of God among you, created for you since the beginning of the world. Here's another way of interpreting that, another way of saying it that I think is very helpful. What Jesus says is the promise that will be fulfilled at the end judgment is this: that God created the world to live in such a way that it functions under his direct rule, where there is righteousness between all people. And at the end of all things, that will finally be unleashed on the world in reality, because the people who will be left are all the people who chose to submit to the way of Jesus in their lifetime. Does that make sense? There was a world in Genesis 1 through 3 that was the direct reign of God, where people lived in righteous peace with one another. And someday that will happen again. This has been prepared for you since the foundation of the world. This is not starting something brand new that's never happened before. This is refreshing and recreating what God intended it to be from the beginning. Are you with me? Yes or no? Sort of. Thank you, Shirley. I will give a little more detail. That's why I really did. It's hard to tell sometimes. The Bible story is that God created the world to be at peace with him, with the planet, with other humans. Sin is the breaking of that peace. And so when Jesus says, "Enter into the kingdom my Father has prepared for you since the foundation of the world," there was this peace, there will be this peace. It is restoring the way God intended it to be. That's the Bible's promise of resurrection. And evil, those who choose not to follow the way of Jesus, will be removed. Is that a little more clear? Good. And if you have more questions, ask during Bible class. You're going to inherit the basileia, the reign of God. Come into your reward. This is it, the fulfillment of the life you've been living as you awaited the king's return. If you live in the way of Jesus, then there's nothing else you want more than to be in a place where you can live in the way of Jesus without fear of persecution or suffering by those who don't. That's the reward that Jesus is promising here. And then he says something that's about to get real provocative. You're blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world for. Everybody say for. Now, the Greek word for is the word gar. Everybody say gar. Everybody say it like a pirate. Gar. That's how you'll remember it now. Prepared for you, and then he says, for I was hungry. Now, what does the word for mean? The word gar, it's just a preposition, and you know it intuitively, but I need you to understand it intellectually. It's a conjunction used to express cause. It's an A-B relationship. This happened, therefore this is happening. Does that make sense? This is happening because of that. This is happening, you're entering the kingdom because I was hungry and you fed me. Why are these people welcome to the kingdom? Because of what they did in these following statements. Because they fed hungry Jesus. They gave water to thirsty Jesus. They welcomed stranger Jesus into their home. They clothed naked Jesus. They cared for sick Jesus. They visited imprisoned Jesus. This is the reason they're welcomed into the eternal reign of God. Now I have to pause for a moment because I'm about to say some things that I know are going to be provocative. I've listened through this entire Matthew series. Every week I listen to somewhere between 3 and 6 sermons from various preachers around the world. And there's been a few guys who have kind of gone through it chapter by chapter the way we have. So I've been interested to hear how they pick up on some of these things. And what I've found is that the closer we've gotten to the end of Matthew, the more unmoored they become from Matthew himself or from Jesus. They get to a passage like this, and they immediately run to all the things Jesus can't possibly mean. Their theology gets in the way of listening to the King Jesus. Back to biology class, when I showed up for the final, I was nervous because I had studied. I had crammed a whole bunch in the previous couple of weeks, and I had this notebook that I had never really filled out because I hadn't really been to class. And I show up just with the notebook, hoping that I can flip through and find some of it, knowing it's an hour-and-a-half long class. There's no way in the world I'm going to get an A on this test. I no longer have the guy to cheat from, and I no longer have Google. So I'm in trouble. And then I show up, and probably 2/3 of the class have a piece of paper covered in writing front and back. And I lean to the person next to me, and I ask this girl, I say, "What is that?" She goes, "Oh, well, this test was on Thursday. We came in on Tuesday, and the professor told us everything that was going to be on the test. And it's open notes, so we wrote down all the questions, and then we went and studied them, and all the answers are right here on this piece of paper." There's only one problem. I didn't go. I've got a book full of notes that I don't know the answer to because I never really filled them out. It's a binder full, and they've got a cheat sheet on one piece of paper, front and back. And there's a chair in between us so that we can't cheat. Again, would you like to guess how I did on the final? I did not do very well. They could ace the test. Literally ace it by having one page of notes. Do you know how badly I wanted that cheat sheet? Do you know how badly I regretted not going at least to the class on Tuesday? That would have been all I really needed. But I didn't show up. And so instead, I was left to fail. In verse 34 through 36, this is what's going to be on the final. This is it. You came this morning, so you get the cheat sheet. Here you go again. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, you invited me into your home. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, you cared for me. I was in prison, you visited me. There's your cheat sheet. That's the final. Now, that should make us go, thank you, Jesus. Because that is just the fulfillment of what he has been teaching us for the entire Gospel of Matthew. This is what it looks like to live that out. But we're about to get real uncomfortable because I want you to pay attention to all of the things that were not on the test. I can see it in your face. You are uncomfortable. That means you're paying attention. I'm uncomfortable too. Your orthodoxy, not on the test. Your creed or lack thereof, not mentioned in that verse. Your religious tradition, the name on the door, somehow didn't show up. Your worship practice, not in there. Your doctrinal rightness or wrongness. Your church attendance, your moral purity, your denominational affiliation, or anything else. Now, it's in the notes. It's good to have that stuff. But it's not on the final. You see, all of that other stuff, and this is what Jesus has been saying for the last 3 chapters, all that other stuff is useful only in as much as it points you to this lifestyle. If your doctrinal creeds, your religious affiliation, your church attendance, your statement of belief, your worship practice, if they don't push you to doing the things that are going to be on the final, they are worthless. But if the church does these other things right, then every single one of those things helps you live out the way of Jesus, because it's reminding you about who Jesus is and what he has called us to. It is the way that we rally around these things together that we might encourage each other to be more like Jesus. Being like Jesus is what's on the final. What you know doesn't matter unless you do something with it. And it turns out what you're doing with it is way more important than what or how you know it. Oh, thank God. Now, I know saying that in a church is dangerous because for a lot of us, we were taught what we think or believe about something is what's on the test. That's not the test. And that's a good thing. Because I know how much my beliefs or thought process have changed just in the last couple of years. And if I had been judged based on what Aaron back then knew, I'd have been in real trouble. And that's assuming I'm right about any of it now. Newsflash. I kind of just assume I'm wrong about most of it. I'm just doing the best I can. And I know you. You're wrong about most of it too. Because you disagree with me. What we know and believe is very important if it pushes us to be more like Jesus. But if you are forced to choose between doing what Jesus did or believing what people tell you you're supposed to believe, choose to do what Jesus did. That's what's on the final. Now there's a question that lingers. When Jesus says, here's what's on the final, it's all people related, isn't it? And it's a specific group of people. Why is it the group of people who he calls out the hungry, the naked, the jailed, the imprisoned, all those kind of things? Because these are the people whom Jesus surrounded himself with. We memorize that verse about how he was surrounded by the crowds, and the crowds would bring to him, they're sick, they're needy. He looked and he saw the crowds of people and he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. These are the people Jesus cared about. In the middle of the empire, Jesus announced a kingdom, and the kingdom was the kingdom of everybody else. It was all the people for whom the empire had not worked. The empires of the world crush people. The power of the empire corrupts people. The wealth of the empire changes people. And what Christians are called to do is be focused on the people who are trampled underneath the heel of the empire. The kingdom shows up where the empire has failed. The kingdom shows up in the places the empire ignores, and the king's people serve the people the empire tramples, overlooks, and throws away. Now, if you're paying attention, and I know that you are, you're going to remember the two commandments Jesus said are the most important. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And in this chapter, those two things underlie the entire thing. The parable of the 10 bridesmaids is about 5 bridesmaids who loved the groom so much they were ready no matter how late he showed up. That's love the Lord your God with everything you have. And the one at the end is love your neighbor at yourself. The sheep and the goats is all about did you love your neighbor? And the one in the middle, the parable of the talents, is where those two intersect. The king has loved you enough to give you his kingdom, and do you love him enough to go to the other people that Jesus couldn't reach on his own because he was just one person needing a church? This is the intersection of love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. When we do what Jesus did and obey what he taught, then we experience this foretaste of eternal life here and now. And we participate in the kingdom of heaven now, and we look forward to experiencing it fully when Jesus returns. Jesus' disciples are eagerly awaiting a life where they can live out this love for each other in the direct reign of God. And so the big question in Matthew 25 is whether you actually want to live faithfully in the kingdom of God. The first thing the disciples need to hear in this chapter was to keep their love for Jesus front and center. The second thing was to stay on mission, and the third one was this: faithful disciples love and serve the people Jesus loved and served. Now, everything I just said could get me branded as a heretic. In fact, someday this video is going to be viewed by somebody on YouTube who's doing what I did and listening to 5 or 6 preachers to kind of hear what they said. And they're going to hear that part, and it's going to stand out as different from everything else that the other preachers have said. And they're going to go, I don't know that that's true. That may be heresy. It is not what I've heard other preachers preach. And it can go into the realm of heresy for some because it sounds like I'm just telling you about salvation by works. I'm not. This is not salvation by works. Being saved is Jesus pulling us up out of the water that we're drowning in, pulling us out of the systems of the world that have corrupted people and that have broken families and individuals, that have condemned people to hell here on earth and in the life to come. The salvation from that doesn't come from you and I doing anything. It shows up because Jesus showed up and invited us to participate in it. That is grace. That Jesus has invited you to share in his kingdom. That is grace that you or I could not do on our own. You're not saved by yourself. We're saved by Jesus. He did all the saving. And we're saved by faith, which is our allegiance to King Jesus. It's our faithfulness through this life. It's the only thing that makes sense in the Bible story, and this is what Jesus is teaching here. Here's my prayer for our church, collectively, our family of believers here. That when we say we love, share, and serve like Jesus, it just wraps up this lifestyle right here. It is that we would ever more be committed to our love for God and others, that we would share our life and the gospel with the people around us, and that we would serve one another in the family and serve the community around us, that we might take Jesus to the people in our community who so desperately need him. My prayer for our church, on the individual level and collective, is that when he returns, whenever that is, he will find us to be his good and faithful servants. I believe that we are on the path for that because we are disciples. Imperfect though we are here to encourage one another to be disciples together. If we can encourage you on that walk in any way, you can come and let us know how as we stand and sing together.